Well, good morning, good evening to all of you out there, and welcome to another Thursday morning live stream with the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. I'm Sandy Campbell, the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. We're thrilled to have you here today. We, of course, have a lot of things coming up. Next week, we are going to get into all the issues around the Voice of America, and we'll be featuring Steve Herman, who is the White House correspondent for Voice of America. That's next Thursday, the 11th, also at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And then the following week, we're going back into our Russia disruption series, where we will feature amazing professor Andrei Sengankov from San Francisco State University, who's going to talk all about Russia and U.S. bilateral relations. Along the same lines, in our Russia disruption program, as many of you know, we're doing this in collaboration with the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations and the Malikian Center at Arizona State University. And on April 8th, we'll feature Dr. Fiona Hill, which should be quite an interesting one. And then on May 19th, we'll be featuring Jamie Firestone, who is a lawyer and was in Moscow for many years and crossed paths and defended and worked with Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky and so on. And he has a fascinating story to tell us. So that's coming on May 19th. And of course, all those details are available on our website and in our news digest that goes out every Wednesday. As many of you noted, yesterday I sent out a teaser for our annual gala and who our big speaker will be. It will be on April the 21st, and I promise you be a pretty fantastic speaker who will be able to dig into all kinds of the issues behind the headlines that he himself created in many ways. So that is on the 21st of April. That's a Wednesday, and all kinds of details about our gala are forthcoming. So without any further ado, let me introduce today's two speakers, and then we are going to get into some fantastic conversation about this pandemic that we're currently in. So let me welcome to our screen two esteemed gentlemen. First, we have Adrian Wooldridge. Adrian is the management editor and Schumpeter columnist for The Economist. Welcome, Adrian. It's great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
And then we also have John Micklethwait, who is currently the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News and was previously editor-in-chief at The Economist. Welcome, John. A great pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So I'm going to turn the conversation over to the two of you. And as always, folks out there, type in your questions into the Q&A box. And we will get to them in about 40 minutes time. So John, Adrian, over to you.
Well, Sandy, thank you. It's a delight always to be in anything to do with Santa Fe is good. And we're delighted to be here. Even better that you have a program designed to disrupt Russia, which strikes me as a good thing to do from Santa Fe. I think the starting point for this book, The Wake Up Call, was really kind of two big ideas which hit us last year and which actually we would argue are even more true now than they were then, even more pressing and urgent. And one of those rare cases where a book we've written has been more validated by events than not. And I suppose the first big insight in the wake of COVID was that government matters. Government is now incredibly important. The most basic, it's the difference between living and dying. And the easiest way to do that, to see how that matters, is to look at the sort of mortality tables. And if you strip out most of the noise and you focus on how many deaths there are per million people, I just checked at the moment. In Britain, where I am at the moment, where Adrian is as well, there are 1,895 deaths for every million inhabitants, sadly, from COVID. In America, there are 1,570. In Germany, there are 888, so roughly half the level in Britain, or less than half the level in Britain, and close to half the level in America. If you go to Asia, you find countries like Japan with 65 in Japan against 1,570 in the US. Deaths there from COVID. And you go around places like Singapore, Taiwan, Indonesia, South Korea, they are all unbelievably lower. And places that have generally had good government, you could also include New Zealand, Australia within this, have generally done much, much better. And this, we should say, is from two people who have come from what might be described as the free market end debate. We both worked at the Economist for a long time. We have to some extent a distrustive government in parts of our system. But what is clear is that during this period of time, having government that worked made a huge difference. And if you want a very kind of sort of vivid version of that, just look at London, New York, and Seoul. Those are three enormous capitals. In fact, Seoul is slightly bigger than London or New York, but imagine they're the same size. Now look at the number of people who have died in each of those. In London, the number is now 14,000. In one period, more people died of COVID during one 4-week period than died during the worst bit of the Blitz during the Second World War. New York, sadly, is 30,000, so twice as many. Seoul, I tried to double check the figure this morning. It's in the hundreds. The total for the whole of South Korea is only 1,600 people. So it's barely a tenth of London, barely 5% of what's happened in New York. And the point about this is that you can come up with lots of excuses. You can claim that Asia has a more consensus culture. You can try and claim that it's something inherently autocratic in it. Absolute rubbish. You know, Seoul is a vibrant, huge city, subways, nightclubs, the whole shebang, really. It's the home of K-pop, which most of our children listen to, and some of the world's biggest nightclubs. It's the place which gave us Parasite, which won last year. It has a chaotic, sometimes sometimes difficult democracy. But the basic fact is that the authorities there were far more efficient than either in Britain or America. Now that would stand by itself, and we'll come back to all the reasons why Western government is being left behind by Asian government. But there's another statistic to consider before that. That is China. Now, under those numbers, where America, as I said, is around 1570, and the UK is 1895, China's number, I just checked on the Bloomberg virus tracker this morning, is still officially 3 people, just 3 people for every million inhabitants, just over 3, in fact. Well, we will all immediately pass scorn on that and say, well, they're probably hiding. And I think most people think they're hiding some, but take a level of, say, 10 times that number. Imagine that China is hiding 9 out of 10 cases. And I think I probably have more journalists working for me in China than any other Western organization. I don't think our journalists think it's at that level, but there's always some degree of manipulation of statistics there. But go with the number of it being 10 times as much. Well, you look at that number, that is still 50 times, push the number up to 30, that is 50 times better than the United States. The United States was 50 times worse at protecting its inhabitants than a regime which is seen as its main geopolitical competitor. And the point about this is these are astounding numbers. In the private sector, if somebody was 5% better than you, you'd be worried for your business. Someone was 50% better than you, you'd probably be thinking you were heading for the boneyard. If somebody was 5 times better than you, you just assume you'd already lost. 50 times is an unbelievable level for one public sector, better than another one. So the reason why this is interesting is because also it's not just a question of America's current great competitor, it's a question of history. And that is where I'm going to hand over to Adrian.
Thank you, John. One of the central contentions of this book, The Wake-Up Call, is that we might be living through a historical transformation, a historical turning point in terms of the balance of power in the world. And people might look back at this year, at this period, 2020, 2021, and argue that it's not just significant because we saw the end of the Trump presidency. It's not just significant because we saw the COVID pandemic, but it's significant ultimately because it saw the shift, a dramatic shift in the global balance of power away from the United States, Europe, and the West in general towards China. In many ways, that's not so much a change in the balance of power, but a restoration of the old balance of power, because through most of history, China has really been the center of the world, and the United States and Europe have been peripheries for the last 400 to 500 years, the West has been powerful, important, and central indeed to human history, but that actually may be an aberration, and we may discover whether it's an aberration in the next few years. So go with me back to the year 1500. Imagine the world in 1500. What you see in 1500 is that Europe is a blood-soaked battlefield, in many ways simply an irrelevancy. America is at that point an unsettled by the West, unsettled continent. It's largely empty. It's lived in by indigenous people. It's not part of the Western bloc. China, on the other hand, is the very, very center of global civilization. It accounts for about 20% of world GDP, with another 20% accounted for by the Indian subcontinent. It has the world's largest city in the form of Peking. It has the world's largest and most sophisticated civil service, with civil servants chosen by the world's most sophisticated examinations from right across the continent, this continent-sized country. It has the world's largest navy, with ships that absolutely dwarf any ships that you see in Europe at that time. It really is, it also has the world's biggest encyclopedia. In fact, the biggest encyclopedia that was ever created until Wikipedia is in the imperial capital. So it's an astonishingly rich and powerful civilization. And look at it, look at Europe by contrast. London is a tiny city. It's a fraction of the size of Beijing. The state in Britain or in France can hardly command its own territories. The countries in Europe are being torn apart by wars of religion, by civil wars. The aristocrats are sort of bands of roaming thugs marauding across the country. Then what you get for the next 300 to 400 years is a period in which the West really pulls ahead of the rest of the world. And it pulls ahead of the rest of the world, not just in terms of commerce, although it does do that. It pulls ahead of the rest of the world, not just in science, although it does do that, but also in terms of state power. The West invents and reinvents and keeps improving the modern state. First of all, you get the invention of the nation state in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, a state that claims a monopoly of violence, that brings the aristocrats under control, that ends the wars of religion, and that really establishes some sort of internal monopoly of power, but also learns to project its power, not just within Europe, although it does that very, very substantially, but also right across the world. So you have basically the advent of Western imperialism through Western companies such as the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, voyages across the world. And we associate this in our book with the person of Thomas Hobbes, who in Leviathan argues that the fundamental thing that the state must do is to guarantee the safety from arbitrary violent attack of its citizens. Then, after that, you get the reinvention of the state in the West with the rise of the liberal state, in America with the American Revolution, in France with the French Revolution, and in Britain with a much more sort of Pacific revolution, whereby you get the establishment of the power of Parliament and the limitation of the power of government. So this liberal revolution is all about limiting the power of the government, making the government accountable, at least to a section of the people, and above all, introducing competition in the heart of government. So government ceases to be something that's basically parasitic about extracting rents from the people and providing the rich with sinecures, and becomes something that's to do with giving jobs to people on the basis of merit and making sure that those people serve the public. And we associate this liberal revolution in the state with the figure of John Stuart Mill and Mill's great works on liberty and on government, which argue for a sort of meritocratic limited state. And thirdly, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, you get yet another reinvention of the state, which is the rise of the modern welfare state, which says that the state must provide security, Hobbes's definition of what the basic thing that the state must do, but that security doesn't mean just protecting people from attack and arbitrary violence. It means providing with education, pensions, sick pay, a health system, the basic rudiments of the welfare state. And you get that starting in Germany, then in Britain and in France, eventually spreading to the United States in the 1930s with FDR and his creation of an American version of the welfare state. And so this is all happening in the West. It's all about inventing and reinventing the state, making sure it can be both efficient and just and fair to the people. And it essentially reaches its high point in the 1960s, when you get the United States sending a man to the moon, the United States creating a Great Society program, which says that we'll get rid of poverty, a feeling of optimism in Britain about harnessing the power of science to create a more just and meritocratic society. The 30 years of rapid growth in France after the war, culminating in the 1960s with the creation of a highly efficient, centralized, technocratic government system. All this time, China and Asia has been stagnating. They've been basically doing nothing to improve their state. The state in China remains frozen in what it was, first of all, in the era of the Mandarins. Then it begins to collapse with the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong. So the state seems to be moving in different directions. It's becoming ever more ambitious and ever more sophisticated in the West, and ever more dismal and incompetent in the East. Then the 1960s come along and things begin to move in a rather different direction. John.
Well, yes, I mean, since, again, we are writing a book of broad generalizations, but I think you can make this. Since the 1960s, basically the West has gradually, on the whole, got weaker when it comes to government, and bits of developing Asia have got much better. In terms of West, I think you have to argue, it's quite interesting, you look back at the 1960s, that was the last time when, you know, a massive majority of Americans trusted their government. Back then, now it's a sort of fraction of that, well below 50% anyway. But back then there really was a kind of sense that it worked. It was also the time when the best and the brightest went into government. It was seen as something normal and good and positive to go and do, and it wasn't decried. Since then, of course, you have had moments where the West looked very triumphant. The end of the Cold War would be one. You've had some attempts to reform, and we've come back to whether you think Reagan and Thatcher were a good thing, but by any measure, they did sort of challenge the status quo. But in general, what has happened to the Western state is that it's got bigger without getting better. And it's ended up in a state whereby people are endlessly asking it to do things, whilst at the same time not really being prepared to give it the resources to do it. And in a sense, pretty much, certainly in the two countries we talk about most, Britain and America, there's been a sort of intellectual stalemate. And it depends which side of the fence you're on in terms of how lazy and incompetent you think the other one is. But on the right, there has really been only one answer to the question, what should you do with the state? And this goes all the way back to Reagan, but it's since become a sort of bastardized, limp form of that. And the answer always on the right is, we want a smaller state. We want a state so small that you can drown it in a bathtub, to quote Grover Norquist. That doesn't make sense. If you want an ever smaller state, go to the Congo. You'll find a very small state there. Go to New York, as I said, during COVID. Then you had a state that didn't work. It was extremely small. Might have been large, but it certainly wasn't acting like a state that worked. So the right has retreated to almost a kind of sort of persistent sense of we don't. Our only answer is to say smaller. On the left, the problem is also one of laziness, but this time it is tied to the public sector unions. The left is interested in the state, but largely from the point of view of a sort of lobbying power. You look at the problems to do with teachers' unions and the failures of American schools on a sort of big scale, and the ties to the Democratic Party, as we pointed out before. If you go to a Democratic convention, If you don't know what the person next door to you is doing, you just ask, which school are you teaching at? And they'll tell you quite quickly. And you're seeing that right now with Joe Biden's problems with teachers at the moment. So you have a sort of bankruptcy in a sense, where there are very few fresh ideas, certainly not the big revolutions that Adrian described earlier. Thatcher and Reagan, again, you can see some elements where that did count. I think the idea of privatization back then was a radical new idea. I think there was an attempt to sort of rethink what the boundaries between the state and the private sector were. But really, if you look at it, within 10 years, the state was growing faster than it had done before. And when you look at the growth of the state, you shouldn't just look at the raw numbers of GDP to economy, although in general that's got bigger and it's got bigger again because of COVID. You should also look at the sprawl of regulations, obviously United States on the federal level, but also at the state level, the number of things you need permission to go and do. And these are being driven both by the right and both by the left. You're just as likely to hear the cry, something should be done from Fox News or the Daily Mail as you are from the New York Times or PBS or whichever particular things you want to follow on that. So the Western government, I think we can all agree, no one is very happy with it. The difference really comes in Asia, starting in Singapore and then copied from there. You had something rather similar to what happened in the private sector in cars. You remember Honda, Toyota, these companies in the 1970s, they suddenly started producing cars that were much smaller, much better. And they pushed aside Detroit, often rather kind of brutally in the 70s. But what happened there was that Western car makers began to fight back. They copied lean production techniques. They did all those sort of things. Well, you have exactly the same happening in the state. You end up with Singapore, which is a tiny state, and deliberately so compared with the Western states, but is much better at providing services. You are certainly much healthier, more likely to live a long life, likely to be better educated at high school level, certainly if you're in Singapore than if you're in America. And the interesting question here for Republicans is you look and see what's happening there. Nobody in the Republican Party would want to pay a public servant $1 million a year. Well, if you run the Singaporean civil service, you get paid over $1 million because they think it's a really important job, and they much rather have people who are good, who they pay a lot of money to get things done, than the other way around. And the same goes to the left as well. I mentioned teachers union. If you're a bad teacher in Singapore, you're out. Not even the chance, the second chance. You don't get kept on in the same way as they do in many parts of America for political reasons. So there is a real accent on delivering service. You look at all those things to do with health, education, all the basic ways in which you deliver things. There's greater security there. Some cases, citizens have to contribute more, others less. And what is happening is that model of smaller, better government has been spreading around Asia. Other people have been picking up and copying it, including as ultimately China. But we have not been doing that. Exactly the opposite to what happened in the car industry. It's like Detroit has carried on making ever bigger gas-guzzling cars whilst not actually really following. And this is causing a sort of really big divide, because we talk about, in our book, we talk about COVID being a test. It's an examination. And that is precisely what it is. If you think of a test, if you suddenly set a test in a school for a group of pupils, well, then you will find, you'll probably be able to guess which ones will come top, because it's the ones who are good at other things and the ones which will come bottom. You're always going to find one or two outliers. In COVID, Greece, not traditionally seen as the best run European country, did rather well. But in general, most of the countries you'd expect not to have done well because they don't pay much attention to government, including, sadly, Britain and America, featured in that list. By contrast, the countries which came top of the list, the Asian countries, the Nordics, New Zealand, all these different places, they are exactly the same ones who finished top of the list for health. They finished top of the list for education. So it's not a fluke. These are the people who put attention and time into government. And I think there we can see that kind of COVID is like a thing which has suddenly revealed that to the West. That does not mean that the West is less powerful than Asia. It certainly does not mean democracies are less powerful than autocracies. We deliberately totally refute that. Most of the successful countries which have done well have been democracies. at this. China is a great exception, but you look at it, it's countries that have taken government seriously and have a record of doing that who've done well at this. Countries that haven't are on the other side of it. There is one postscript to that, which is worth saying: vaccines. Finally, we have an area where the British and Americans are doing well. I just looked again this morning. In Britain, 32 out of every 100 people has been vaccinated. In America, it's 28. European Union is down around 8, and some of the Asian countries are quite low as well. But this, in a sense, if any of you play soccer, is a bit like a sort of soccer match. We've lost the match 5-0, and we scored a couple of consolation goals in the final bit. When you look at the death toll that has been enacted on our populations just to do reasonably okay with vaccines, at the end seems a sort of slightly limp reward. So the basic lesson of this book is you've got to look and study what works. If you don't do that, you run the risk of falling behind. So Adrian's now going to tell you what we think our solutions are.
Yes, we should. Thank you. We should emphasize that this is a book about solutions, not just a book about problems. We've been a bit pessimistic in some ways in saying that the West has not really performed as well as it ought to have done during the pandemic. We've been a bit pessimistic in which we said that the world might well revert to a world in which the West is peripheral once again to the center of human civilization. But the book is called The Wake-Up Call, and it's called The Wake-Up Call because we think we still have time to wake up. It won't be easy, but we do have time to wake up. So we look at solutions in this book. The first solution, or false solution, we look at is just get rid of Trump. There is a sort of sense in the United States, I think, that the real cause of America's really rather poor response to the COVID crisis and of its government problems more generally is just that you had Trump and a slightly out of control Republican Party. And I think Trump obviously made a mess of things, and the negativity of the Republican Party, particularly about government, is a very serious problem. But there's a lot more to what's going on than that. I think if you'd never had Trump, you still would have had a very serious problem with the vaccine. Trump didn't invent a decentralized, rather anarchic healthcare system, which basically puts all its resources into helping the old and infirm rather than promoting public health, because of that's because of a system which rewards fee for service, essentially a market-based system which rewards people, rich people who can pay for services. So Trump didn't create that. America had the terrible tragedy of the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and of the riots that swept through the cities of the United States. But Trump didn't invent an out-of-control police force. Trump didn't invent racial antagonisms in the United States, although he certainly exploited them to a certain degree. These were things that had been going on for years. Riots in American cities. John covered the riots in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. So a lot of these problems have festered for a long time, and the overwhelming problem of America not taking government seriously enough, not investing enough in government, and not investing enough intellectually and imaginatively in government really started in the 1960s. It long precedes the world of Trump. So just getting rid of Trump is not going to solve these problems. So you need a much bigger and much more considered look at what's wrong with American government. We suggest a number of things that need to be done about American government. One is that you need to re-engage the rich or the more privileged people in government. Government used to be something that everybody participated in, but the rich participated in particular. They believed in giving back through public service. And if you go back to JFK, the son of an extremely successful businessman, he in part went into politics, well, partly because he liked the thrill, but partly because he really did believe in giving back to the country, and he believed that was central to the American creed. That has now gone. The brightest and best Americans go into Silicon Valley, they go into private equities, they go into New York finance. They don't go into government anymore because not just partly because the rewards are so poor, but also more importantly because they're not given the freedom to do what they want to do in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity. So we would like to encourage more privileged people to go back into government service. And in order to do that, we think that government service needs to allow people more freedom to innovate and improve its quality. We believe in having much more competition in government. In the mid-19th century, when government in Britain was basically a set of parasites, extracting rent through sinecures and things like that, but Gladstone improved that situation by opening jobs up to competition. And we think that same spirit of competition could improve vast sectors of the public sector in the United States, particularly the education sector. The education sector now has that basically, it's almost impossible to sack teachers. If they do the most appalling things, they're just kept on. It's impossible to promote people really quickly. It's impossible to give high levels of pay to really, really good people, all things which they do in Singapore, because they become public sector monopolies governed by very, very tight rules and governed by the procedures of trade unions. We think we need to get beyond that to reintroduce competition into the sector. We need to get rid of corruption or quasi-corruption, the way in which big corporations buy privileged access to government, almost by votes in the system. That's, again, it's a bit like the 19th century, the mid-19th century, when you had government as a parasite. We need to say, no, you can't have corruption. You have in the United States, I think, $1.6 trillion worth of exemptions on taxes at the same time that you're starving important sectors of your political system, of your welfare system. You have vast exemptions for the rich. Again, all of that needs to be attacked in a big concerted move of government reform. We think that this government reform needs to come not just from the left, because the left is very attached to public sector unions, not just from the right, because the right has got a habit of denigrating government, but from a sort of revived creative center. And we invent this figure in our book, an imaginary president called Bill Lincoln, who is a compound of William Gladstone, the great British reforming 19th century prime minister, and Abraham Lincoln, again from exactly the same period, because they really represent the energy of the center. And we do think that we need the energy of the center. I don't know whether Biden will be able to represent that energy. What we're trying to do is encourage him in this book to represent that energy, taking on his own vested interests, as well as the vested interests of the right in the country. And we also argue that what America needs to do is to look at the rest of the world. America became great partly because of its ability to look at the rest of the world, to copy from the rest of the world. America is an exceptional country, but it's not an exceptional country in the sense that it's isolated from the rest of the world. It's an exceptional country because it has taken the rest of the world's lessons and used them to its advantage. The founders looked at the way that Britain worked, the way that France worked, the way that the ancient world worked, and based its constitution on all of those models. Teddy Roosevelt in the late 19th century looked at the evils of too much power in the hands of a few people, looked at history, looked at what was going on in Europe in particular, and said, we can't go on in this way. FDR did exactly the same thing in the 1930s. He looked at people like Keynes and looked at their policies. And we say in this book that America needs to have exactly the same spirit now. Look at the rest of the world, look at what it's doing well. Above all, look at countries like Singapore, which seem to have managed to combine having a slim, efficient state with an extremely successful one when it comes to welfare. So we argue in this book that America in particular can revive itself, that it's not doomed by history to see its preeminence decline. The same for Europe, that Europe can revive itself. But we have seen a radical change in the last few years. We have seen China creeping up, becoming much more powerful. And we have in this pandemic seen the weaknesses of the West massively exposed. We've done much worse in the West than we should have done. And the hidden strengths of China in particular also exposed. China has done remarkably well in controlling this pandemic and in getting back to work. Most people in China are now back to work in the way that they aren't in the United States or Europe. So this is potentially a turning point. We still have massive residual strengths, but we have to understand that things have been going wrong for a long time. And the only way that we can really reveal these hidden strengths is by taking government seriously and having a big program of vital government reform. Thank you very much. We'd love to hear your questions on all of that.
Oh, well, thank you indeed. And let me encourage all to ask your questions in the Q&A bar below. I certainly have a few questions. And Adrian, I think I'm just going to pick up from where you just left off. As someone who grew up in more of a social democracy in Canada, you know, there's a much different sense of rights and understanding of rights, and that in certain cases, collective rights are far more important than individual rights. In New Mexico, when we look south to, you know, our neighbors in Texas, I think we find the opposite is really true, that there's this American ideal of individual rights as being the most important bundle of rights available, and therefore, how dare government tell individuals what to do, because individuals inherently know or believe that they know what the best thing to do is. So how do you, in your book, do you address this issue of rights, of you know, of a population's beliefs that are not necessarily reflected in government? You know, given as well the United States, we have so many different layers and levels of government, where the federal government can do one thing or not do one thing, and then a state government can do something very different. So how does the conception of rights sort of slot into your diagnosis of, you know, of the West or of American response to coronavirus?
Absolutely. We try in this book to have, I mean, this book was sparked off by the pandemic, but it's not just a book about the pandemic. It's a book about what happens to governments and to human populations when they're subjected to a big shock. Because I think when you're subjected to a big shock, you not only get managerial issues raised, which is how do you deal with this pandemic? How do you vaccinate people as efficiently as possible? You also get very fundamental questions about the nature of government and the relationship between man and the state. So we tried to make this book a work of philosophy as much as a work of analysis of pandemics. And the philosophers that we address in this book is Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes said that when you have big shocks, such as a war or a civil war or a revolution, the rights of individuals have to be rendered almost irrelevant compared with the rights of the state. Individuals have to be willing to give up their rights to government. Then we look at Mill, who says exactly the opposite, that you must have a primacy of rights, of individual rights. We also look at Plato, who says that the rights of individuals need to be counterbalanced by the claims of good government and the claims of a wise, what he regarded as a wise ruling class to dictate certain things. So we put these arguments about rights right at the center of what we say. I think the arguments we make are several. One is that rights always have to be balanced against responsibilities. It's crazy to claim that you have a right to wander around not wearing a mask in the middle of a pandemic, because you also have responsibilities not to infect other human beings with the disease that you're carrying. We also say that rights have to be judged in terms of the context in which they're operating. So at certain times, you know, Hobbes is right. At certain times, you do have to create a Hobbesian world in which you give all your rights essentially up to the state. That is during a war, during a pandemic, during the worst parts of the pandemic, because what you do is so intimately affecting the rights of other people that the collective must win. So we talk must be taken into consideration. So, but we also say it's important that although Hobbes should triumph for a while, and indeed, you know, we've stayed in, you know, we're in lockdown in Britain at the moment, and many countries are still in lockdown. And that means really giving up all your rights to freedom of movement to the government. We say that is right in the short term, but also in the longer term, you have to go back to John Stuart Mill and say, ultimately, we want a world in which the state is willing to give up power as well as willing to take power. And when it gives up power, that power must go back to individuals. So, you know, ultimately, you know, we're saying Hobbes must be a short-term solution. Ultimately, in the general way of running things, rights belong to individuals, and governments have to be accountable to those individuals through their government, through parliament and through representative institutions.
Well, and staying with the United States, we had under the Trump administration no national policy whatsoever in terms of individual response to the pandemic, and they were arguing essentially this is for the states to determine and kicking it to the states. John, do you think that part of the problem in the West's response or in the United States response to coronavirus is because we had conflicting levels of government? Do we have too much government that gets in the way of an effective response?
I think in America possibly yes, or it's certainly having a lot of layers of government, plus also on top of that having a not very functioning center. I think made it much more difficult for America in a way that people I think didn't entirely realize. If you want, Germany has a federal system, hasn't been great on the vaccines, but on terms of sort of dealing with the pandemic, it did quite well for most of the period. Germany certainly twice as good as America. What's interesting to me is that it's a sort of mixture. You have to have some element of, if you're going to have a federal system, you've got to have some element of national direction. I think, I'm not trying to make political points, but on the whole, I don't think anyone would praise Donald Trump in that respect. I think, before Democrats start yapping away, saying that that's all just down to them, you look at the problems in New York, the problems between a Democratic mayor and a Democratic governor were self-evident. So it's not just sort of federal to state, it's also state to local. There is quite a strong case at different times. I wish I could claim I knew the exact government of Santa Fe much better than I do. But certainly if you look at California, which you and I were talking about before we came in, California's map, the kind of governmental map of California does look as if it was designed by a child on drugs. It's insane. You have some cities which are gigantic, some which are small. I think LA is 4 million people, and other cities only have 1,200 people in it. Everything is over, and it's overlapping series of police districts and so on. And everyone, there's no real way in which anyone would claim this is efficiently run. Certainly compared with two things. Certainly compared with the way that, on the whole, Asian countries have thought about this. They've actually tried to design what they're doing for a modern age, and sort of enormously compared with the private sector. Every single thing in American government is very, very elderly. One very obvious example, and we're not just picking on education, but it stands out, is the insane system whereby everyone's children in America disappear for 3 months holiday or close to that in the summer. There is no surer way for a child to lose knowledge. It's not just sort of, it's just a fact. If you keep people out of school that long, and you dig into the reason why is the schools of America, the most prosperous country on earth, are run according to the agricultural timetable. Because the theory is that all those children in New York and Los Angeles, their parents are all working on the harvest, and they need to go back and help them. This is an insane way to sort of run things. So in a lot of cases, there's nothing inherently wrong with federalism, but federalism sort of unrelated to modernity and unrelated to a kind of central function. I think yes, in general, I think the federal system did not work particularly well in the pandemic.
Yeah, and it's certainly for us in New Mexico, we have a full understanding that we're all in this together. And when Texas decides to eliminate its mask mandate or opening up its business 100%, there's, on the one hand, we want to respect that states can make those kinds of decisions, but on the other hand, they're making a decision for us ultimately, and that's where things get a little frightening.
The reason why I was being a little bit tepid in that is I do think if you look at American government, some of the better bits of it are at the local level. Cities are the obvious bit. Cities are the one bit of America where you could really point and say things are happening. It used to be the states, now it tends to be much more the cities. The cities, you have mayors who feel somehow accountable for what's happening in that particular region. And yes, they'll blame the state in different cases, and they blame the federal government in different cases. But on the whole, there is greater accountability at the city level than there is at others, and competition between them is useful.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the public sector for a minute. I think when historians look back at this era in decades to come, we'll be shocked to see how we incentivized, essentially the money counters and the people moving money from one fund to another, and starved, the other sectors of successful society, not paying our teachers sufficiently. And I think you obviously put your finger very much on the right spot in terms of, we don't reward our bureaucrats. We don't reward people in our public system, and therefore we don't attract new and fresh blood into it. I don't know if it's quite as simple as just offering much more money to people to enter the public sector, because there is a culture within the public sector that kind of frustrates innovation and creativity. So how does Singapore, how does the argument flow? Yes, we can incentivize the public sector more, but how do we reform the attitude, the culture of the public sector, or even just the perception of the public sector in the public that may be negative towards it or hostile towards it? Adrian, you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I think there are two things that we need to talk about here. One is the perception of the public sector. And there has come in the United States in particular, not only in the United States, but in the United States in particular, a perception that the public sector is for second raters. That if you're really, really good, you go into the private sector and invent the new world. That if you're not so good, you go into the public sector and just draw your salary check and accumulate your pension and retire as soon as you possibly can. And I think that's a result really of a propaganda war, successful propaganda war, won by Reagan and his successors. Since then, the Republican Party has constantly denigrated the public sector, constantly said that the public sector is not really where the action is. It's the private sector that creates wealth, the public sector that spends that wealth, the private sector that's full of entrepreneurial heroes, the public sector that is full of drones. That's completely different from the worldview in the 1960s, when working for the public sector was somehow was regarded as a noble and a very fulfilling thing. And I think that perception, you think of Ronald Reagan saying the 10 most terrifying words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, or saying in his inaugural speech that the government is not the solution, it's the problem. And when he was doing that, there was some truth in that. The public sector had become too big, it had become too sprawling, it was interfering too much in the private economy and trying to do things that were best left to companies. But the Republican Party has just kept repeating and repeating and repeating those mantras when they've ceased to be useful or ceased to be helpful. So the perception of the public sector needs to be changed. We need to go back to the sort of Kennedy view that this is something that all good people ought to want to do. So that's one problem, is the perception. But the other problem, I think, is a sort of the internal culture of the public sector. Because Americans don't trust public sector workers, they put all sorts of controls on their behavior. They erect endless rules, as if you go to the government in order to steal from the government, and you can only be prevented from stealing or lying under your desk, sleeping all day or whatever, by having lots and lots of rules about what you can do. So I think that accumulation of rules, tiny, tiny rules, telling everybody how to spend their time, preventing them from exercising their freedom and best judgment, makes the public sector unattractive to people who are creative and people who want to do their best. They go into the private sector where they're allowed to be more innovative. And finally, I think there is a very, I may have sounded so far like a sort of unreconstructed lefty, but I also think there is a very dangerous nexus between organized unions and the public sector. You see it with the police unions, making it impossible to sack policemen, however badly they behave. You see it with the teachers' unions, you see it with the prison guards' unions, all the way. The biggest problem with unions is not that they extract a high price for their work, but they prevent productivity improving work. They prevent people, they prevent organizations from increasing productivity by using labor more effectively. So it's a set of very negative incentives, and so people, young people in particular, the brightest of them, go into finance, they go into consulting, and they go into increasingly into Silicon Valley. That's where the brains of society is allocated, and that is ultimately very, very dangerous, because ultimately a society that doesn't have a good, innovative, creative government will decay.
I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about the fourth estate for a minute. We'll put your editor and journalism hats on for a second. And I guess two questions. One is, how do you feel that the media, and I don't really like the term mainstream media, but the major media outlets, how do you feel like they have done in responding to and reporting on the pandemic, in sort of illustrating a lot of the issues you're talking about? Let me ask that one first, and then I have a follow-up question from the audience. And John, why don't we ask you about your thoughts about the media's response to coronavirus?
I think on the whole, it's been quite good, actually. I think I defended on coronavirus more than I would on some other things. I know in America there's been a degree of politicization of kind of one group sort of putting across the idea that masks were a terrible thing, and another group coming in, various things like that became sort of totemic symbols. I think, to be fair to the media, that was partly driven by the president. I think that wasn't, that was a row he started. Everywhere else, people just said, pretty much without exception, people said, well, sorry, without the exceptions of Brazil and I think Uzbekistan, people just said, wear masks and get on with it. I think on the whole, I'm sure the media have made mistakes, but it doesn't strike me as being quite as bad or as other more fratricidal parts of the media. I think on the whole, it's shown some of the advantages of things like sort of social media, the ability of people to feed in. There's been quite a lot of good coverage about individual things to do with things. Bloomberg, we do both a virus tracker now, a vaccine tracker. Those are huge data things, and the media on the whole have made those free to people so they can go look at them. So I think on that, please don't take me as an unapologetic apologist for the media, although I obviously have to, I'm part of the people you attack quite correctly on this, because the media attack other people. But I think on COVID, it hasn't been that bad. Adrian may have completely the opposite point of view.
No, I have completely the same view as you on this, but I would emphasize one thing, which is just how much innovation has gone on the media side, because you have organizations which are used to having people gathered together in one place in order to produce their magazines. We produce The Economist now for more than a year without physically meeting together. We do it all online, or I say they do. I can't
relief to your colleagues
stand these computers, but that's an extraordinary act of innovation, and adaptation to new circumstances, to be able to produce this agglomeration of information, to gather it all together and do it with people sitting in their own homes rather than going and meeting together in offices. It's a testimony to the power of technologies such as the power of Zoom. We couldn't have done it 5 years ago, but it is extraordinary that we can do that, and extraordinary. We must remember during this pandemic how much daily life has changed, and how much people have adapted seamlessly to this new world.
Well, let's stay with media points, but jump to social media, which has really reshaped a lot of our collective knowledge, let's say, in so many different ways and so quickly. Disinformation and misinformation are prevalent right now. I was reading things around people believing that the vaccine would also have a microchip in it that the government would be injecting into us, concerns that pregnant women or women of reproductive age have advanced about the vaccine that are based on no evidence whatsoever. What is the role of, and the obvious sort of question that's hard to answer too, how do we counter the influence of social media in terms of advancing narratives that don't necessarily help our response to the coronavirus? And John, maybe I'll throw that to you first.
I think there's two things. I would, in general, make the comment that I think there's been a slight kind of flight to quality, notwithstanding the things you've said. I'm going to come back and answer the bits you said. In general, there seems to be a slight flight to quality. People suddenly really desperately needed to know what was going on when COVID occurred. So people were suddenly much more prepared to pay subscriptions for things. They wanted to get facts. And there's an element where the kind of sort of joke social media thing went off. The second point is, in general, you know, the history of media is really simple. Is whenever you get a multiplication of technology, you get all kinds of weird stuff happening. And I think we're living through one of those phases, which is gradually beginning to normalize. You can already see it in the main. I was the Economist with Adrian. We were one of the few people with paywalls. Now, you know, you look at the Bloomberg, but also the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Washington Post. People are building big audiences, huge audiences of people who are prepared to pay for decent information. The obvious comparison to me between the internet is you go back to the invention of the steam press, the early 19th century, which is when people just created utter rubbish. Suddenly you could print off things far quicker, and sort of libels of a nature even today would have seemed absurd. And the best-selling newspaper at the time was the New York Sun, invented by a man called Benjamin Day. And it used to run stories with things saying that half men, half mutants were living on the moon. You could argue that isn't any different from saying that Bill Gates has invented the virus and brought it to you. But I think this was something that, you know, was the world's biggest selling newspaper at the time. So that there was a sort of different level. And what then happened is that quality began to win out. People wanted to know what the facts were. They were prepared to pay for it. Advertisers didn't want to have their soap advertised next door to those half bat, half mutants. I think something similar is sort of vaguely happening now, with one big exception. I do think that there has been a collapse of local news in different places, because it's much harder to justify. And there is, you are right, that social media has the ability to create these storms on a much bigger, more global aspect than we've ever seen before, and that's very difficult. Sorry, one last thing. I think it's also very hard to do things somewhat privately. It's very good that we can get cameras, phones, even to places like China, and you can see horrific things happening when they're happening. The media on the whole was much better at reporting and looking into what happened in Wuhan in the beginning than the World Health Organization has been, in my opinion. So that's one good side, but the bad side is that really bad stuff can get out there incredibly quickly, as you pointed out. So my answer is it's generally getting better, but I wouldn't deny for a second that there's still a lot of bad stuff out there.
Well, let's go for maybe just the last batch of questions. Is this an opportunity to reimagine the compact between global governments? You just talked about WHO, global governance and national governments, between national governments and state governments, between ultimately, you know, national governments or global governments and individuals. Is that the best gift of this pandemic in many ways, is illustrating the things that aren't working effectively, but also showing us the ways in which we can reimagine in this crazy new time we're in, the connection between, you know, ultimately your tax dollar and the services received from it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the greatest gift of this pandemic, in some ways, is it teaches us that government really matters. As John said, that government is the thing that makes the difference between living and dying quite often. And once you grasp that fundamental point, you start asking big questions, such as what is government for? How do you best organize it? And how do you get the best results out of it? And I think one of the big questions about how you best organize it is what appropriate level should decisions be taken on? And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about during this session, but let's use our last few minutes to think about it a little bit, is global government in various ways. Because, you know, what you see in a pandemic is a global problem that ultimately needs global solutions. And we should use this moment to revise and revivify our sense of global institutions, to look at global institutions and see if they're working well. You know, improve the WHO. I know that by leaving it, America did a very foolish thing, and I'm glad it's rejoined. But there is a sense that many of these organizations become a little bit antiquated and become a little bit self-indulgent. The WHO was fine, but not great. I think the United Nations is fine, but not great. The Europe in my opinion, I didn't vote for Brexit, is fine, but not great. And Europe has done extremely badly in terms of the distribution and purchasing of the vaccine. You know, the level of take-up in Europe is far, far lower than it is in Great Britain or the United States. So we should use this moment to revive these institutions and use the moment of Biden's re-election for America to re-engage with these institutions, because ultimately, you know, democracy will triumph over autocracy. The West, to use the term West loosely, will triumph over China if we can operate on a global scale and get institutions working together and upholding fundamental human rights, fundamental human values, and the values of democracy. So we talked about the failure of local government or state government, but ultimately, you know, what we should really be focusing on now, I think, and taking the advantage of Biden's re-engagement in the world is reviving, but also improving global government institutions.
Can I quickly just add one last thing on that, which is, as Adrian said, you know, this book is a plea to the West to wake up. You know, it was written for a reason. We wanted to sort of tell people, look how far you're suddenly slipping behind. Please do something. And with Biden, actually, I think there is an opportunity. Just imagine, for the sake of argument, that Donald Trump was right about one thing, that the West is now, and America is in competition with China. Well, it's almost like he had a good diagnosis and completely the wrong prescription, because his version of trying to win this new Cold War, as he saw it, was exactly the opposite to the way that America won the last Cold War. America won the last Cold War by singing a song of freedom and by using allies. And Trump's doctrine was America first. And that was a disaster. One, because if you don't talk about things like freedom, you have no kind of moral grounds for being say you're better. Yes, I'm not, you know, very obviously America didn't always live up to those things, but at least it always kept on talking about it, and it gave the air that they were important to them. Trump never, very rarely bothered to do that. And secondly, if all you say to your neighbors is me first, then strangely, it's not a very inspiring message. So the collapse of alliances, and COVID was the first kind of really big global catastrophe where America didn't lead. It was a laggard by any means. So if you're Biden, you know, there is an opportunity there. You have the chance to reach out and begin to kind of reunite the democracies of the world and do things where, yes, but part of the price of that is trying to make these global institutions work. But you look at, just to end on an optimistic note, you look at the strength of the democracies. You can argue whether America is stronger than China. We would say it is. You can argue whether Europe is stronger than China. We would say China might be stronger than Europe. The one thing which is totally unarguable is that Europe plus America is stronger than China. And then if you start adding in the other democracies, India, Indonesia, Japan, by any measure, South Korea, many of the countries we've been talking about are unbelievably stronger than the totalitarian side of things. So there is an immense opportunity, but if you have crap government, it's not the way to sell yourself to the world. So our message is wake up. You know, America has the most imaginative, dynamic private sector in the world. Some of that has got to the public sector. And again, I know there are probably people on the call who have worked in the public sector. It's not to diminish many of the very brave things that people do in that particular arena, but taken as a whole, there's no doubt that COVID has exposed what the weaknesses of those are. And so it's time to wake up.
Well put. I mean, I would argue as well, there is no American strength anymore without China and vice versa, and that we're so interwoven, there is really no us versus them anymore. We can think along those ways, but to think of more, there's just a we might be a good way to approach solving a lot of these issues and just recognizing the context around them all. I note my very final question, you gentlemen obviously enjoy working together. You've written 5 books so far. Do you have another one coming? Adrian, you've got some things in the works?
Well, I actually have a book which I haven't written with John. Not that it represents anything, that's, which is called The Aristocracy of Talent: How Meritocracy Made the Modern World. But I'm sure we will have more books in the pipeline. Although I think we're having a bit of a rest at the moment after producing the Wake Up Call at rather astonishing speed.
Very good. Well, John Micklethwait, Adrian Wooldridge, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fantastic conversation. I feel some more optimism than I felt in quite some time about this crazy world we're in. And let me thank you again for taking the time, and have yourself a very pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sandy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. And we'll see you on Tuesday for Great Decisions, and hopefully next Thursday with Steve Herman from the Voice of America to talk about all kinds of things related to Voice of America's past, recent past, and of course, the future. Until then, we'll see you soon.